From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Salinger-Morris. It's Tuesday, October 3. Ever since Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced a long-anticipated inquiry into the COVID-19 pandemic, accusations about it have ricocheted across the nation. Why aren't the state and territory leaders being compelled to give evidence? And why won't some of the more extreme pandemic measures, like lockdown and border control fines, be scrutinised? Entering this void is a new book which comes out today. Life as We Knew It, The Extraordinary Story of Australia's Pandemic, takes us through some of the most critical decisions made during the pandemic. Many of them happened behind closed doors. Today, the authors of that book, health editor Aisha Dow and reporter Melissa Cunningham, tell us about what former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and other key figures told them about Australia's pandemic response and what we need to learn for next time. So, Melissa, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced a long-anticipated COVID inquiry a few weeks ago. What is he seeking to find out, and why has it taken so long?
Yes, so the federal government has announced an expert-led inquiry instead of a wide-ranging royal commission.
Given the enormous dislocation, the stress, of course, loss of life, the economic impact of the pandemic, it is a problem.
And it's going to have to report to the Commonwealth within a year. And so it's going to look at many things from vaccines and medical supplies to financial support for individuals and businesses. But it's also going to hopefully look at the different levels of government and how they coordinated through the National Cabinet.
But we need to examine what went right, what could be done better, with a focus on the future. Because
I think something like this has been really long awaited, and if done right, it will be critical in helping Australia respond to the next pandemic. But there's been calls for this for more than a year.
Okay, and the announcement did cop a lot of criticism from human rights activists, politicians, including opposition leader Peter Dutton, and commentators who fear that some of the sort of more severe pandemic restrictions like lockdowns, border controls, fines, they won't be scrutinised adequately enough. So do you think the inquiry will be thorough enough?
I think that the concerns that have been raised are really legitimate. We have to remember that Australians lived under some of the most severe pandemic restrictions in the world, particularly in Victoria.
It's just 2 hours away from going into lockdown number 6.
Melbourne has officially become the most locked down city in the world.
246 days inside.
Roadmap out of lockdown is going to be long and slow.
Some of the issues that have been raised by advocates and lawyers are concerns that the scope to investigate major decisions state premiers took individually will not be scrutinised closely enough. So there have been calls for a Royal Commission instead. And I think some of those really kind of complex and controversial issues such as lockdowns and school closures are the real concerns that have been raised. And we really have to look at that because they've had the most profound and lingering impacts on people. I think infectious disease expert Robert Boy sums it up pretty well when he said that the states did things differently with different outcomes. But we really need to work out which were the good decisions so we can mirror them again in the future and which are the ones that we could get rid of or do better next time.
Okay, and so Aisha, I really want to get to the failures in a moment. But just before then, there's obviously been this big criticism about the lack of consultation with the premiers of each state. And it's so interesting to speak to both of you because you've worked on this book for more than a year. And as part of your research, you looked into Tasmania and you discovered a really different outlook on the successes and failures of the response. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really fair criticism of the scope of the inquiry that they're not going to examine those decisions made by the individual states and territories. That's because despite the early refrains that we're all in this together, each state and territory really had their own unique COVID response. In fact, perhaps more than anything else, Australia's COVID response would really be defined by the states going it alone and a fracturing of the federation. As we know, for the first time in 100 years, we had residents in different parts of Australia cut off from one another. It was really extraordinary. As you just mentioned, we did a chapter on Tasmania. We actually went to all of the states in Australia. But as part of the Tasmania chapter, we interviewed Peter Gutwein, who, of course, was the Premier of Tasmania during the pandemic or most of the pandemic. They were the first state to announce a border closure back in March 2020. Tasmania has a really old population, and at the time it had like 41 intensive care beds, which, as we now realise, can run out pretty quickly. They were really worried that their medical capacity would be really quickly overwhelmed. So they decided to raise their drawbridge effectively, which was, of course, the Bass Strait. They stopped most visitors coming in. So Peter Gutwin told us for more than a century, Tasmania's biggest disadvantage was that it was an island at the very bottom of the continent. But when COVID arrived, this isolation actually became its greatest strength. So I don't think anyone can really argue that the Tasmanian approach didn't work for Tasmania. They did have an early outbreak at a hospital there, but we barely heard about Tasmania or other places like it, like South Australia or the Northern Territory, because all the terrible disasters that we had during COVID were happening elsewhere. And in our interview with former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who was quite vocal against border closures during the pandemic, as you probably remember, he actually conceded that in some places, he pointed out Western Australia actually, domestic border closures made sense because for those individual states they did work.
And we also saw a lot of tension between, for example, the New South Wales government and the Queensland government. There were people that weren't able to access medical care for a little while. You couldn't see dying relatives. And it was interesting speaking to Anastasia Palaszczuk about that and the friction that emerged between New South Wales and Scott Morrison in particular, where she sort of accused Scott Morrison of a boys' club and leaving female premiers like herself out. But then if you went to WA and spoke to people there, the vast majority of people would have actually been supportive of those border closures at the time because they had less disease, less lockdowns, less deaths. And even Mark McGowan said during an interview with him that he would have no hesitation in doing it all again. But for the people that were caught in the crossfire of that, it was really tragic things that happened, not being with someone when they were dying, and not being able to get medical attention at the start of the pandemic is really concerning. So I think all of those things really need to be scrutinised by this inquiry.
Okay, so you've mentioned there the states that did quite well with their border closures. You mentioned WA and Queensland and South Australia. But I guess what's on all of our minds with regards to this inquiry, and certainly with your book, is that it's so vital to reflect on the decisions we made in terms of how it will impact how we confront a pandemic in the future. So what have you discovered about who we failed the most and what we could have done better?
Yeah, so I reckon a big theme that emerged continually through the research of this book was basically just this sort of lack of nuance with decision making and restrictions. So at the start of the pandemic, it's understandable, there's a lot of unknowns and uncertainty. But as time moved on and the knowledge developed, there was these instances of rigidness of these rules, which I think could have been softened for compassionate reasons. And unfortunately, I think that the people we failed most in Australia were sadly the people that were always going to be most at risk of falling through the cracks. Migrants, essential workers who could not shield themselves from the virus, older Australians, obviously children who were really impacted by remote schooling, and young people. We did a lot of things right, but there were some big failures along the way in managing outbreaks from the public housing towers.
The lockdown of public housing towers at the height of Melbourne's COVID crisis has been slammed by the State Ombudsman.
To the Ruby Princess.
The ship has become the largest single source of COVID-19 infections in Australia.
Terrible outbreaks in aged care.
I wanted the true story told about what happened at St Basil's, what happened to our loved ones.
And I think things that happened during the pandemic would have been unthinkable in pre-pandemic times. And one thing that really shocked me during the research of this book was having, an entire ICU ward in Melbourne. And I think a similar thing happened in Sydney as well, full of Middle Eastern community members who were critically ill during the Delta wave. And this was entire families fighting for their lives. Recent research has indicated that a person born in the Middle East was about 23 times more likely to die of COVID during the Delta wave than somebody born in Australia. So there really is an urgent need to look at why did some of these things go wrong and how do we handle something like this in the future and make sure that the right information and support reaches the people that are most at risk.
Okay, and it's been a year since mandatory isolation was scrapped by National Cabinet. But it seems like the community wants to forget about the pandemic more than perhaps it's willing to reflect on it. So when did this pandemic fatigue begin, and what has it meant for preparing for the next one?
I think we really started noticing it happening in the lead up to the Victorian and the federal elections last year. I remember being at a press conference with the Health Minister in Victoria at the time, Martin Foley. It was probably the middle of last year. A lot of people were dying of COVID at the time. And he actually really wasn't very keen to talk about COVID at all. Journalists at the press conference were pressing him on it. But we really had to get him to kind of say his lines. You could tell it was something that they didn't really want to talk about. Yeah, so political parties obviously put a lot of effort into working what the public want to hear, and clearly their polling at the time would have been saying that people just don't want to hear about COVID anymore. Last year, though, did see a huge amount of COVID deaths. More than 10,000 Australians died, which was more than 7 times higher than the year before when, of course, we were in lockdowns in Melbourne, Sydney and the ACT. But yeah, we largely stopped hearing about it from politicians. People like Victorian Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton, who we'd heard from almost daily, basically stopped being put forward for press conferences at all, which was really quite striking considering how much we'd heard from him in the preceding 2 years.
Right, and it's convenient to forget about COVID and move on, but many people don't actually have that luxury, particularly those thousands of people who are affected by long COVID. You spoke to someone who's battling that condition, a woman named Shireen. Can you tell me about her experience and what her life is like now?
Yeah, so I interviewed Shireen at the start of the year and spoke to her again recently.
You got me on a really emotional day.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, because, oh God, there's so many feelings, Melissa, because it's like the world is moving on, but I'm not.
And she's still living in debilitating pain. It's impacting essentially every aspect of her life. She struggles to walk, she struggles to work, to sleep and to care for her children. And her doctors suspect that she's one of the many tens of thousands of people from across the world who have long COVID, which is sort of lingering effects of the virus.
Pain every day. Do you still have all those symptoms? Have they gotten any better or is it still the same?
Well, with the standing, I can stand a bit longer. Go maybe even 20 minutes, like going up to 20 minutes. I still need my...
So Shireen almost died and spent an extended period in ICU after catching the virus, which is a big risk factor in developing long COVID. And on top of these really awful physical symptoms, she also has mental health issues as a result of how much her life has been altered by this.
When you have everything change, it's not like it's, it's just one thing that's been injured. It's like my whole body as well, and life, like my whole work life, financial life, even that's been a struggle. Everything's just been really hard to prove and to convince people that I'm not making it up.
So in Australia, we've had an inquiry looking into long COVID, and the government is trying to set up strategies of how we're going to deal with this. But it's looking like it's going to be a major problem going forward. It's going to require huge and extensive research and support for people, not just in Australia, but all over the world. And there's so much we don't know about it yet.
And finally, Aisha and Mel, do you believe that this COVID inquiry will actually help prepare us for the next pandemic?
Yeah, it's a good question. As we've sort of outlined before, I don't think it's really possible to properly examine Australia's response to the pandemic by ignoring the fundamental driver of that response, which was the decisions made by the state governments. But I do think that there will be value in some of the things that they're likely to probe in this Commonwealth-focused inquiry that will help us prepare for the next pandemic. Of course, they're going to look at vaccines, they're going to look at quarantine. And if you just look at one of those issues, quarantine, our hotel quarantine system, that was meant to be managed by the federal government, but as you know, ended up being really taken on by the states. It was so important because it allowed most of the country to live without COVID for close to 2 years. But as we also know, it was constantly failing with catastrophic results. And we saw that here in Victoria, of course, during the second wave. It turns out hotels are really bad places for infection control. And a number of experts told us that if we had open air quarantine facilities available before COVID hit, then we might have avoided that second wave in Victoria. Hindsight is always 20/20, but it's interesting, in the Spanish flu, which happened more than 100 years ago, they had a quarantine system in Australia, and that had stopped the Spanish flu coming into Australia for a couple of months and had avoided a wave of deaths then. I think 100 years later, people had thought that the lessons of the Spanish flu were no longer relevant for modern times, but as it turned out, they perhaps were. We haven't heard a lot about quarantine in this phase of the pandemic, and I'd be really interested to hear what the inquiry has to say about that, whether we need plans for quarantine for a future pandemic.
I also believe that in the inquiry, there's a really huge need to examine school closures as well, and how we might do things differently next time. I think the true toll of the pandemic will not be known, for years in Australia, but we're already seeing those lingering impact. We've got rising rates of school refusers. We've got kids who haven't caught up academically, and a surge in really complex mental health issues in children and young people. And Professor Fiona Russell, one of the paediatricians we interviewed, said, in a sense, this has been one giant experiment. So I think we really need to scrutinise school closures and what role they would play in any future pandemics in Australia.
Thank you, Mel and Aisha, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Tammy Mills and Julia Carr-Katzel, with technical assistance by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.